Welcome to season two of the Happy Sensory Corner podcast. At Mendability, we want to help everyone, especially when they're vulnerable, to feel happy, more comfortable in their own skin, more confident, proud of themselves so that they can be their true selves. And so we can all journey together through life more happily. Our contribution is to work on brain health. And as because we know that as our brains grow stronger, healthier, we all benefit, but especially those among us who struggle to sleep or who are overwhelmed by the barrage of information from the environment or who are crippled with anxiety. And so we developed a gentle, family centered program of whole brain games that boosts brain development and activates the brain's self healing mechanisms. It's based on a neuroscience field of environmental enrichment, and we call it sensory enrichment. And so, while we are experts in brain development, we know there's so much more that parents have to navigate, especially when it comes to advocating for your child in a world that doesn't always understand neurodiversity. From school systems to the justice system, parents are often the ones fighting to ensure their child's unique needs are recognized and supported. And so today, we're diving into one of the most complex and emotionally charged areas. What happens when misunderstandings and biases lead to tragic consequences? And so I'm really excited to discuss this today with our guest, McCracken Poston Jr. Let me introduce him formally to you today. McCracken Poston Jr. is an accomplished trial attorney, former Georgia state legislator. Wow.
It's a tough one.
Georgia, say that 10 times fast, right? Former Georgia state legislator and advocate for justice with over 3 decades of experience. He is perhaps best known for his work defending Alvin Ridley, a reclusive man wrongly accused of his wife's murder, whose case became a landmark story in both legal and neurodiversity circles. McCracken's groundbreaking work revealed how societal biases and misunderstandings about neurodiversity can have devastating consequences. In addition to his legal career, McCracken has been featured in Forensic Files, American Justice, The Washington Post, sharing his unique insights into the intersections of law, disability, and advocacy. His book, Zenith Man, about Alvin Ridley's case, offers a powerful reflection on the lessons he learned from this extraordinary case and the broader implications for neurodiverse individuals, especially when they're trying to navigate systems that often fail them. And so, drawing from personal stories, hard earned lessons, McCracken brings both legal expertise and heartfelt understanding to today's conversation. And so, please join me in welcoming McCracken Poston Jr. to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today, McCracken.
Thank you, Kim. That was a embarrassingly long introduction, but I really appreciate you having me on. Someone working in the closest big city to me is Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the head of the autism center there uh, told me that my book was very timely because, as he said it, autism is having its moment right now.
Yeah.
And I really believe it is because when this case was going on, there was no discussion of adult autism. It was never suspected. It was never anything that ever came up because I was ignorant. And I wrote the book from the perspective of an ignorant man about that issue. Um, Alvin Ridley was a TV repairman, had his own Zenith TV franchise. And by the way, when you look at the book, the
Hmm.
full title is Zenith Man: Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom. This is to distinguish it from another book titled Zenith Man, which is a fictionalized account of our trial.
Oh, no way.
And there is no, I had given the title Zenith Man to New Line Cinema for a screenplay that they dabbled with 20 years ago. But I retained literary rights, and I thought there's no way anybody else is going to make a book with that title. And then somebody did, and they just changed
What
our
are the
names
odds?
and put us in Pennsylvania. And I was angry at first, but then I've since thanked that author for getting me off my butt to finally write this story. But in reality, what finally formed this book in my head was only, I should say four now that we're in 2025, only 4 years ago in 2021, when my 79-year-old former client was first diagnosed. And that's 22 years after the trial. So Alvin and I had been telling this story to anybody who would listen. Forensic Files, American Justice, The Washington Post, NPR's Snap Judgment. We were just giving the story away, and I was unsatisfied at each telling because I didn't feel that I could do justice for Alvin,
Mm.
to explain Alvin. He unfortunately, everyone just characterized him as eccentric, oddball, gadfly, all of these descriptive words that aren't necessarily positive. So I did continue, along with my secretary of the last 16 years, we continued to kind of help Alvin navigate what now I understand is the challenges of a neurotypical world full of neurotypical people. And it was pleasant because our case was such a high profile case. I really enjoyed after I got to know Alvin and we accomplished that trial by fire of a trial. We became friends, and he would come to my office and I would help him figure things out. And that went on for years, but the pressure was off for me to try to determine what was going on with Alvin. It was a juror from the case who, through another podcaster, sent the question to me: do you think Alvin may be on the autism spectrum? And now, 22 years after the trial, where I've learned more about autism and adult autism, in my head, I thought, well, of course he is. But we went to Atlanta with Alvin's permission. He allowed me to share on social media the findings, and he was clearly uh, very much on the autism spectrum. And what was fascinating was once Alvin knew this, it was as if his whole spirit lightened. Here's a town that really treated him badly. There was just misunderstandings and misinterpretations all around. I understand that Alvin was not completely comprehending my language in the way that I gave information to him 25 years ago. And I certainly wasn't interpreting properly what he was giving back to me. And so once I had that realization and began to share it, because everybody knew then soon thereafter that I had a book in my head. And so I was sharing it. And this was in part to develop a platform to promote the book, but also to get the attention of publishers and agents. And it was just fascinating the effect of that diagnosis on Alvin's spirit, where he just was a lot lighter. And where he used to just face almost everyone with a menacing stare, he actually began to have more interaction and a lighter countenance. And and really what was then even more amazing was my book came out in February of 2024, just not quite a year ago. And it launched at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, where I will be going uh, tomorrow night for the first public reception of President Carter's body will be brought there tomorrow
Hmm.
night. He was a very great man. I was lucky to have known him, and we're in a real state of grief here in Georgia. But on February 20th, we were there to launch a book. And I didn't know if people would like my book or notice my book. So I chartered a bus, and I have a big family. So I put all my family in the bus, a lot of people from my office, and Alvin. And I went ahead to try to work some press for the event. And then the event came and our bus arrived. And so there were 30 people there, I thought at least we would have. Well, the place filled up. And the moderator was Bill Torpy from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And I just felt wrong being up there in one chair with Bill Torpy in another chair and Alvin being down in the audience. So as the thing started, I said, I've got to have another chair up here. And I invited Alvin. And I had never seen Alvin, we had done some media where there's a camera person and a sound person, and Alvin did very well for himself speaking, but I had never heard him speak. Well, I take that back. In 1984, Alvin ran for sheriff of Catoosa County, Georgia. And this was at the beginning of a spiraling downward of his business, of a lot of conspiracies that he held against leaders in the community, and a lot of lawsuits that he filed. Uh, you know, most of them or all of them not successful. But in his anger, he ran for sheriff. And I write about it in the book because I was a young man just 4 years from my first political run. So, so I was interested, and I watched him as he mounted the steps to the courthouse to take the microphone because it was kind of cruel that everybody just kind of they were planning on making fun of Alvin because of the way he had been behaving in the community and shuttering his business for no real apparent reason. Um, and now running for sheriff out of anger because the sheriff's office seized a van as part of a counterclaim against him. So everybody was just interested to hear what he was going to say. Well, Alvin approached the microphone, pulled out a tape recorder, and pressed play. He had recorded the sign off for a local Chattanooga, Tennessee TV station, which included the national anthem. And while all of these people came to jeer and to mock and ridicule him, they now found themselves being pressured to stand up and remove their caps at this big outdoor event. And I thought, this guy's brilliant. He is really kind of controlling the mood here. And he's really taken the breath out of a lot of people who are only here to jeer and ridicule him. And so he really impressed me at that moment. Of course, he didn't do well. He didn't win.
Mm.
But that's the only time I ever saw him in a public speaking event. Well, now we're in Atlanta about to launch my book. I invite him up to sit next to me. And Kim, he stole the show. the moderator said that he didn't really need to be there because Alvin just took over. And it was a very warm, very happy Alvin Ridley, which nobody had ever seen or nobody could remember seeing in Ringgold, Georgia. We followed up that night with our first event in our hometown at an old 1849 stone depot that was big, one of the bigger buildings in town. And I took Alvin early and we sat in the green room and we just tried to anticipate, well, what's it going to be like launching this book in our hometown where we're talking about people here. We're talking about the
Mm-hmm.
people who were opposing him and who were witnesses against him. And Alvin had a very calm demeanor. And we walked out to hundreds of people packed in that depot, probably most people ever been there. And Alvin again steals the show. So Alvin passed away on July 2nd. We had been monitoring at the VA, we had been monitoring his kidney function for years, but ultimately he had a moderate heart attack as we were trying to, he was in the hospital to get a procedure to ease the obstruction that was contributing to his kidney failure. And I am so happy that I was with him when he passed. I just decided it was the 4th of July, which in America is a holiday, and everything's kind of quiet that week because a lot of people are out of town. And I just thought, well, I'm just going to go hang out with Alvin. He had had a moderate heart attack a few nights before, but by all indications, he was going to survive it. And I was just with him, hanging out, having a pleasant conversation. We were talking about heaven, where a few nights before, after his first heart attack, I suggested, Alvin, do you think Virginia, who was his wife, and your mama and daddy may be trying to call you home? And
Yeah.
Alvin immediately said, no, they want me to stay here with you. So by the time Tuesday came along, I decided to try a different approach. And I said, Alvin, I'm looking forward to meeting Virginia in heaven. Now, the notion of me being there made Alvin a lot more relaxed to talk about heaven.
Yeah.
And we had a wonderful conversation before he passed before my eyes.
Oh, wow. Um, was there I just realized, we're talking about Alvin, we're talking about the book. I mentioned that there was a case. Maybe
Yeah,
maybe
I
we
should
should
mention that.
explain what
Let
the
me
court case was.
let me first tell
How
you
did you
that
guys meet for the first time? What were
I,
those circumstances?
I know a lot of your listeners and viewers know who Dolly Parton is. Dolly Parton, born in East Tennessee, went as a teenager to Nashville to become a star. And at some point, very early on, she met a man named Carl Dean. And against her manager's wishes, they decided to get married. Well, the closest place in the U.S. South in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, probably going back to the 40s and 50s, the quickest place to get married in the South was Ringgold, Georgia, where I'm from. That was because of a geographic position in the South near three states fairly immediately, and then other states a short drive away. Well, they came down to Ringgold, Georgia to get married. Well, 3 weeks after Dolly Parton and Carl Dean got married, Alvin and Virginia Ridley married. And that's the woman on the cover of this book. That is an amusement park photo booth photo from 1965 or 66, the year they got married. Well, by the time country stars George Jones and Tammy Wynette got married in Ringgold, Georgia in 1969, Virginia was missing. Her parents caused this
Okay.
article and others to be put in the local papers that she was gone. Well, 30 years later, when Virginia died, we had to deal with this in the National Examiner tabloid. Sicko holds wife captive 30 years and then kills her.
Oh, wow.
And that was the rumor about Alvin. That was the rank speculation about Alvin. And now that was the charge against Alvin, accused of smothering or softly strangling his wife of over 30 years. And when, because I didn't know of Alvin's autism and nobody knew much about adult autism, a lot of his very familiar to your listeners mannerisms were being misinterpreted. When I look back through the trial transcript to write this book, I was embarrassed at how Alvin's neurodivergent mannerisms were being used against him as evidence of guilt. For example, Alvin called 911 to report that his wife wasn't breathing. Well, the first responders all testified at the trial that he sure didn't seem emotionally upset for a guy that just lost his wife of 32 years. Well, I can tell you that Alvin was very upset while I was representing him, but it was just it was a delayed emotional response. Um, People who read my book who are familiar with autism, they tell me I knew from page one. But of course, the story is that I didn't know. And so the story is 15 months of dealing with what I thought was a very difficult person, when in fact he was just an autistic person. And our struggle and the story of our struggle um, was really it was really on me. Alvin was quite consistent. I was struggling. I was struggling in a lot of ways, personally and professionally. I had just lost a race for the United States Congress. Um, I knew that Alvin really didn't trust me or couldn't figure me out yet to know whether I was really helping him or not. Um, there were a couple of moments that I detail in the book when we would just end up yelling at each other a lot in our first meetings. And one breakthrough happened one day because Alvin would always want to talk about the government taking his van. And I understand now that as looping, that he would
Mm-hmm.
always loop back to the issue of the van and make it the focus of everything. Well, when I would try to ask him about Virginia and her life and her reclusiveness, he would always end up talking about the van. So at some point we were yelling at each other and it just got escalated because again, I didn't know how to
Because you're trying
work
to
with Alvin.
represent him and he's talking about
He's
irrelevant stuff.
he
Yeah.
seems hell bent on kneecapping every defense that I'm coming up with. And I tell him, we need to talk about your wife. And Alvin would say, well, no, we don't, because I didn't kill her. But the government did take my van. In other words,
Mm.
that's what we need to be talking about. Well, at some point, I just went, oh, Lord, the van, oh, Lord. And Alvin went completely quiet. And I looked and he had his hands clasped and his eyes closed tightly. He thought I was beginning a prayer. And he was raised in the Baptist church. And he thought respectfully he needed to be quiet and let me pray. And so I just rolled with it. And I prayed my legal advice to Alvin, and we had a strong prayer at the end of every meeting we ever had after that. where I would communicate to him what I needed. That did not mean that Alvin would cooperate. As a matter of fact, I would almost always end the prayer with, and Lord, please let Alvin know I've got to get in his house. I've got to photograph some things. And Alvin would say, I'll think about it. But we got nowhere for months, over a year of me requesting to get in his house, and he wouldn't let me until I began to realize that Alvin was quite transactional. Um, there were things that I could get for him, and just out of a sense of duty or obligation or transactional nature, he would give me some access. Uh, for example, and it really, Alvin in a weird way was pushing me toward the right answers, and I just didn't interpret it always. He was telling me, you need to go look at all the civil litigation. Well, I kept saying, Alvin, this is a murder trial. Um, I know you've got you're mad at the government for all these things that they did to you, you know, but I just had to agree to go look. So I spent a couple of days in the courthouse just looking through the civil stuff of all these civil suits. But I found another
Those are the suits that he had instigated, right?
that he had filed and the counterclaim that ultimately took his
Because of that
van.
van.
And then I realized that the van had been only gone for 3 weeks. Alvin had successfully appealed it on his own to the court of, to the court and got the van returned. But in his stubbornness, he refused to accept it, as he said. And he said that it would trigger a new statute of limitations once he touched it. So the van had been sitting in his yard for 15 years untouched at that time. Last July, 40 years
Wow.
untouched. He never changed his position on that. But but also in the courthouse, because I was just looking under his name, I found a file that was an eviction, a 1970 eviction of Alvin from the public housing apartment. That meant that was 4 years after their marriage, 2 years after her parents were saying that she had gone missing.
Gone missing, yeah.
And I find in the jury file, in the case file, a jury list. And I recognized some names on it. And I called one of the names that was still alive and I asked Mary Hakes, I said, look, I just found your name in this file. You were apparently a juror in this eviction case 27 years ago. And I just didn't know if you could remember anything at all about it. And she said, I remember it like it was yesterday. She said that man made a circus out of the court, and the judge just stopped the trial and said, Mr. Ridley, send for your wife. Virginia's parents were in the courtroom. So I know the eviction was created by her parents and the rumor mills. And Alvin's father goes and fetches Virginia, and she appeared in the old courtroom of the Catoosa County Courthouse September 15, 1970, and told the court and everybody listening, I'm with my husband. When I married him, we became one. This is where I want to be. And she was furious at her parents. The judge sent she and her parents into chambers. He allowed Alvin's father to go witness the conversation, but he wouldn't let Alvin go. And it was only because Alvin pushed me that I found this file, which was a very public sighting of Virginia, years, at least 2 years into her seclusion. And she never forgave her parents. Now, Virginia suffered from epilepsy. And in truth, I suspect that she may have been neurodivergent herself. But in addition to her epilepsy, she had a condition called hypergraphia. And I only learned this in the strangest circumstance 4 weeks before the trial. For one thing, I had nothing, and the DA was giving me more and more state witnesses. So in August of 1998, I got a brief continuance for the trial so that I could uh, evaluate these new witnesses that the state had given me. But I had nothing. Alvin still wasn't letting me in his house. He still didn't want to talk about the trial much. He wanted to talk about that van. Um,
So who was
but
he accused
he was
by to have murdered his wife?
the state of Georgia. The state of
Based on
Georgia.
what? Based on
Well, she had markings on her face that can happen in asphyxiation. My argument was, following Alvin's description of their last hours together, that she had epilepsy, that she had a seizure, and that they are from the seizure. The state of Georgia's medical examiner was saying that's too much to be from a seizure. And it may have been from overexertive resuscitation efforts, which Alvin's own description did not indicate that he was able to do that because she was already dead when he woke up. But that was the state's position. Now, a tragic coincidence or of timing was that right after our continuance, the Olympic track star, U.S. team Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner passed away in September of 1998. In October of 1998, her autopsy was released and made public that she had died of a seizure disorder. And so I knew that there's an example. It's just hard to go get in 1998 anyway to find examples of uh,
precedent?
death. Yeah, of death from epilepsy. It's a condition that's very well uh, maintained with medication. Um, but for Florence Griffith Joyner's autopsy really blew the state of Georgia's theory out of the water because she had more petechia than Virginia. And the Orange County, California medical examiner, this was a famous athlete. They were going to make sure she had a, you know, class A autopsy. And their conclusion was that she died of a seizure disorder. So if Virginia Ridley, by Georgia's theory, had been murdered, then Florence Griffith Joyner was severely murdered or more aggressively murdered. But in fact, she died of a seizure disorder. The wonderful, again, tragic thing was that she was an incredible athlete, Florence Griffith Joyner, but she was dogged by performance enhancing drug allegations in her life. And in this thorough autopsy, they determined that she had nothing stronger than Benadryl and Tylenol in therapeutic levels in her system. And that went back a while too. And so she was vindicated in her death, and she gave us something to really challenge the state of Georgia's. Uh,
Here's another person through
yeah,
misunderstanding. We thought one thing and the truth was another. But you still had you still had your key witness giving you a hard time and behaving in ways in court that would not support your case.
well,
Tell us
I
what
had
are
planned
some of the
to.
things that maybe Alvin did or said on the witness stand or, in questioning that made it more difficult for you.
Well, Kim, I did not plan on putting Alvin on the stand. Now, he had a right to be on the stand, and he had the right to not be on the stand, but that is only the defendant's call. But I had convinced him, I thought, that because he cannot let go of that van, that that would not be perceived well by jurors if he did not seem sympathetic enough and that he only wanted to talk about this van being taken. And in my mind, I thought this is not going to be very well perceived by the jury.
Do you
And
think that the justice system has evolved now to the point where autistic behavior is familiar enough that if it's displayed, that everybody says, "Oh, it's autism."
well, we didn't know then, but in a
Then
weird
no, I could
way,
see that, at the time it would have looked very strange and very suspicious, but I'm wondering if now it would have actually supported your case to have him speak obsessively about a specific topic.
well, of course, if we could explain the nature of some people with autism to obsess over some things or to say things. One of the challenges was, of course, Alvin was very literal, and I didn't know what I was dealing with, but he seemed content with my advice that he not take the stand. And there's another legal theory about not taking the stand that can help you on appeal, perhaps. If the state had made error or the judge had made error and we got to appeal and perhaps have a new trial, then if Alvin did not testify, then nobody's got anything on him under oath, under cross-examination. So there was a professional reason that I thought it wise that he not testify. But our trial was not easy. We had a witness that was horrible, that I just did not vet him well enough. Alvin loved him, uh, but he was the who I thought was a forensic pathologist, and as it turned out, he wasn't licensed to do that work. But Alvin still thought the world of him because Alvin equated him to some of the TV shows that he and Virginia liked to watch. And Alvin even insisted that I bring him to his house. Now, meanwhile, you have to understand that how did I first get into the house is an
Yeah, I
amazing
was
story.
thinking you didn't get into the house for months,
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden he's inviting this guy.
no, not until I got in.
Okay.
But I did not get in by design. My parents made a turkey plate on Thanksgiving Day, 1998. And at the end of my visit with them, they instructed me to take Mr. Ridley a turkey plate. And that's the last place I wanted to go on my day off.
Mm.
But my parents made it. They went through the trouble. I had even tried to get a phone installed in Alvin's house so that we could communicate better. And when I showed up with the phone guy, Alvin figured out my ploy and decided to have the phone mounted on the porch outside the main part of the house. And so we played these games of me trying to get him to go in a certain direction and him outsmarting me, basically. And so I just showed up at his house. I knew I was just going to stand at the door, hand him a brown bag of food, and wish him well, and walk away. What I didn't expect was this transactional nature of Alvin when I showed up with this wonderful meal that smelled so good. I think it touched him so that he felt he needed to give me something in return. And he said, just a minute. He closed the door and went in the house. I could hear the TV turning down. I could hear thought I heard him talking to somebody. He came out and opened the door and said, "Come on in." And this was Thanksgiving of 1998 with a first week of January trial scheduled. And so I was 5 weeks or 4 weeks away from trial, 5 weeks. And so I went in, and it was there I discovered amazingly this evidence of this hypergraphia that Virginia had, which our epilepsy expert told me hours before I put him on the stand to talk about petechial hemorrhages. He asked if there's anything else unusual about this woman, and I said, yeah, she couldn't have a thought without writing it down. And he just quickly said, well, that's hypergraphia. Some of my temporal lobe epilepsy patients have it. He said it doesn't affect what she writes, but it just compels her to write it. Well, there was everything. It was a loose leaf journal of over 3 decades. There were recipes. There were talked about the moon landings. There was other correspondence. She wrote President Richard M. Nixon in the early 1970s. What about their eviction from public housing that she was still angry at her family about? She wrote television ministries. She wrote things about the world as she observed it from Alvin's reports and from television. Um, she wrote a proposed pitch to an old TV show called Unsolved Mysteries. It was in the
Oh yeah. Oh
1980s.
yeah.
And her proposed pitch was about the taking of Alvin's van. And so I began to see glossaries in her hand. She had a very distinctive hand, legal glossaries that made me think that she was the author of a lot of Alvin's civil litigation. And they both called motions, legal motions, they called them emotions. And so some of Alvin's earlier pleadings that were typed out talked about emotion to continue or emotion to for a trial. And
Mm.
so I thought it was kind of quaint that they called him emotions, and it kind of fit actually. But so I had to struggle with Alvin, but all of these things were happening that made me realize this man is innocent. I don't know what makes him tick, but he at base is a loving guy who loved this woman and she loved him. And there were writings up until just before the day she died expressing her love for him and how the city of Ringgold messed up their water line. So she was on top of things. And and so of course she was reclusive and she wrote about that.
In the book you talk about them being reclusive. Do you think he supported her, or was he comfortable being reclusive? Do you think that was an autistic thing?
I think they both were somewhat reclusive, but Alvin got out. He got out and worked at the flea market after he shut his business down. Alvin at first, blamed the taking of the van being one of the things that led to his business closing. In later years, he kind of admitted to me that it was probably the advent of solid state circuitry that did him in. He said that people just throw their TVs away now. It used to be the televisions were huge
Yes.
and they were encased very often in heavy wooden furniture cabinetry.
Yes.
And so this was something that you just could not throw in the car and take to a repairman. That repairman came to you. And Alvin was amazing. His reputation was stellar as a TV repairman. By everybody's account, he was reasonably priced. He could fix anything. And when we were picking a jury, when I started asking those questions, I noted that Alvin seemed to sit up and have this pride about him, even though he was looking down the barrel of a murder charge. I had found something that made him proud and made him kind of more comfortable, uh, that recognition. And so it's very important that for to know that as the trial was winding down during one of our lunches one day, and we had these other characters that were kind of following us around and, you know, being part of it. Alvin went from church to church until they ran him off because very often his behaviors would talk about the van, talking about his mother's roof needing to be fixed. And I found correspondence from two churches saying, you're welcome to come to church here, but quit talking about these things and quit basically poor mouthing, as we call it around here, um, because people are giving you funds and they don't seem to ever make it to your mother's roof. And so I just thought my idea for him not testifying was the best until Jesus showed up at lunch and made an appearance to Alvin and told him that he had to testify. Well,
Oh, wow.
that was the one lunch I was sitting at another table. But I knew in my heart of hearts that that was Alvin's decision whether to testify or not, and not mine. So I just briefly took him into um, the, well, I need to tell you this story first. Um, Alvin did not trust me with Virginia's writings. And we had to have a compromise to where I would copy the ones that I thought were relevant that we should use. And it got to
I
where
hope that you mean photocopy.
photocopy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, photocopy, of course, because I had to serve them on the DA or I couldn't use them at all.
So he did trust you long enough to take them to a machine to be
No,
photocopied,
no,
or you had to bring a photocopy machine into the
he
house?
controlled them. He loaded them up in these two giant. First, I spent 4 days in that house. Spent 4 days, business hours over the Thanksgiving weekend, and a couple of days into the next week, um, categorizing them and finding what were really good, the ones that talked about her not wanting to see her family
Hmm.
and talking about talking to the sheriff. These were in the period of time that she's supposed to be in captivity and she's talking to the sheriff. And that's because her family kept sending the sheriff out to try to uh, roust her out. Now, in her parents' defense, her father died and her mother was in a nursing home at the time of this trial. So her siblings and some people in the community just took up the mantle of the old allegations that he's keeping her locked up. He won't let her
And
out.
they're the ones who probably wrote the newspaper and said, "Here's what's happening,"
Absolutely.
and
And it was the community's ignorance about autism. Now, you asked a little while ago, how would that
yeah.
be today? Well, without a diagnosis, we'd still be in the same boat. And that's what I hope my book is a call to action for. There are 5 million undiagnosed adults in the US, it is estimated, who have some form of autism. Now, the risk for misunderstanding and misjudgment is higher with those individuals than it is with a neurotypical person who is understanding the questions being asked of them. And
That's right.
I even got ahead because Alvin did not trust me with these papers that were critical to me. Because Alvin didn't trust me with them, he kept them in these old suitcases. He and a guy who was not even a lawyer, who was his only friend in the world, they were second guessing all of my legal advice to him. And it was driving me completely to distraction. But I had enough that I thought we've got a chance. Well, the problem with Alvin not trusting me, he brought these old suitcases into the courthouse every day, and he opened them up in the small windowless courtroom where we began our trial, and he unleashed scores of cockroaches. Now, the Forensic Files episode about our
On
case,
purpose or just because they
they
were so
were they
old?
were they were Virginia kept a tidy house. I could tell by the coroner's pictures. But Alvin had really let it go over the year, and he was bringing fast food into the house and leaving it half uneaten in bags. And the vermin just came in on his house uh, to extreme.
Mm.
And no, there were just cockroaches everywhere.
Oh, wow.
And now they were in the courtroom. And the judge, after 3 days,
You
uh,
can't make up this kind of stuff.
well, and I didn't realize that the jurors were seeing them. But Forensic Files, season 5, episode 9, one of the jurors is talking about all the cockroaches crawling out of those suitcases. And I was discreetly just trying to brush them away or step on them. And it was almost like every day because he wouldn't let me keep the documents. Every day he would bring home a whole suitcase, two suitcases full of cockroaches again. And he would open them up and rifle through them. Well, the court personnel and everybody figured out we were being infested with cockroaches. So the judge ordered us to change into the other older courthouse in the old grand courtroom where I wanted to try the case in the first place. But we moved halfway through the trial. And I began to realize on the way over there, and I told Alvin, I said, do you realize we are taking Virginia's writings to the last place she was ever seen in public at that eviction trial, September 15, 1970. And I felt just eeriness and almost a supercharged uh, feeling that I'm reuniting these writings with the last place she had ever been seen in public, punctuating the fact that she had been seen in public in these 30 years and that she had pronounced, I want to be with my husband. And her parents never did another article like this after that eviction trial. Her
Mm.
parents pretty much accepted her decision, but now they had gone and everybody was falling back to the old allegations. So it was eerie. It was amazing. And then after Jesus told Alvin he had to testify, I put him up. And I decided, you know what? I'm just going to let Alvin say what he wants to say. So for hours, I just led him through this history, the eviction, the taking of the van. Well, I thought the DA would object about that, but the DA wanted to get in the stuff about the van to try to show that Alvin was disingenuous, that he, was lying,
Mm-hmm.
and that he even got into the eviction and found in and brought out stuff I didn't even know that that the reason for the eviction was that they felt that Alvin was and Virginia were not using the apartment. Well, in Virginia's writings, she's resolved that the exterminator came in on her and made a pass at her. while she was bathing.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to, maybe a neurotypical guy is going to go and confront the exterminator, threaten him, beat him up. Alvin decided with Virginia that they were just going to leave the apartment on the days they thought the exterminator would run. Well, ultimately, they were leaving the apartment every day and spending more and more time with his parents or even in his Zenith shop. And just to avoid this issue with the exterminator and the manager of the housing authority. So, but it was clear to me that Virginia's parents were behind the eviction because they were there at the trial. And so Alvin actually was quite comfortable on the stand. He, I got ahead of myself and I forgot how Alvin is. And so I wanted to finish strong. And I said, Alvin, can you tell the jurors what you've lost? And I wanted him to say, the love of my life,
Yeah,
my
something
only
like that.
friend. But
Yeah.
of course, Alvin, being autistic and very literal, said, oh, I guess the funeral bill. And it sounded so in the DA's parlance, cold and detached that the DA made a big point of you know um, bringing it up in his closing argument. But I realized it. I thought, I just have to be very literal with Alvin. I just have to ask him literal questions. And he, he he really had goaded me and pushed me in all the right directions um, that I needed. I had just lost a race for the United States Congress. I was still licking my wounds when Alvin approached me. I knew him. He was my childhood TV repairman. He and I had had an encounter when I was in my early teens when he came to fix our TV and I was watching wrestling, live wrestling out of Chattanooga. And I didn't realize there was a man in the room. And I realized, oh my God, there's a strange man in the room with me. And he's also watching wrestling. And he is fixing our TV for a minor problem. But he mentions that he has met Andre the Giant and that Andre the Giant eats, as Alvin put it, a dozen eggs and a loaf of bread for breakfast every morning. And I remembered it because I went to school and told everybody I know somebody who knows Andre the Giant. And I lived in Graysville, a small community 5 miles away from Ringgold, so I didn't know Alvin's reputation in town. I just thought it was a cool story from an unusual TV repairman. The only reason I remembered that was during the representation, Alvin volunteers that he's met Andre the Giant and what his breakfast was. And it hit me. You've told me this before. You told me this before when I was like 13 because I went to school and told everybody. And it made me it drew us closer. Alvin always liked my father. My father always liked Alvin. And so my dad always dealt with outsiders. My dad, in his own way, he suffered from alcoholism his whole life, pretty much. And I was having to deal with that while I was trying to manage this very unusual and difficult, in my view, client. And so it was just I will say that everything in the book is true. And interestingly enough, after waiting until I'm in my 60s to write it, perhaps, everybody is redeemed in this book. Even Alvin's detractors and prosecutors. It just seems that everybody was acting on what they thought at the time, the information they had at the time. So we can't be angry at people who did not know about autism, did not know about adult autism, and didn't know why Alvin seemed to be being evasive. Um, I can't hold that against those people as much as can't hold my own ignorance against myself. But I give Alvin credit for hanging with me. Over the years, he had uh, either fired or his lawyers had run away from his civil cases. And I realized that only during the trial with him on the stand that here, this is the first time he has kept a lawyer from the beginning of a matter to the end of it. And I thought, I'm going to bring this up, just kind of a feather in my own cap. I said, Alvin, as a matter of fact, this is the first case that you've ever kept a lawyer from the beginning through the end. And his answer was in perfect timing. He said, so far. And the jurors had the same reaction that you're having. The jurors were chuckling. And I thought, this is a murder trial. And we've got them laughing unintentionally and at my expense, but they're laughing. And I thought that was a good sign. And I learned again a lesson from Alvin. He's thinking very literally, well, the trial's not over yet, and I haven't kept you from the beginning to the end because it's not over yet. So it was
So
it
tell
was
me about some of the broader implications. Now, you said that the call to action in this book was to um,
better
something
educate,
about
better educate police, lawyers like myself, and judges. We all in the legal field, we all know a judge somewhere who could change his decision on sentencing just by the way he or she perceived the defendant. And if
isn't it on the
that,
defendant's team? Isn't it up to them to bring up that issue? If we're looking for somebody
let me
who's
just tell
most
you that
likely,
right now in a criminal trial, when you think your client may have some developmental disability,
yeah,
you ask for a psychological evaluation. A lot of
yes.
times they're in jail and you have to get the court to order one for a psychologist to access your client. And they were not testing for autism. Right now, I'm not sure that they are all testing for autism. I'm representing a young autistic man right now who was having a seizure of his own. His grandmother called an ambulance, and along with the ambulance came law enforcement. When he came out of the seizure, he was afraid, confused, and of course, he ends up with an obstruction of justice charge, which is ridiculous. But it's because of misunderstandings, and um, I I am hoping that there's better testing of criminal suspects or defendants, better understanding at the suspect level by police, and better interpretation by the lawyer even of what they're dealing with because
Mm.
they can raise these issues. Well, of course, Your Honor, he said that because he interpreted it as this. And until we make it mandatory that these things are tested, we're gonna, now so many children, it's determined at school age that they're on the autism spectrum.
But there's those 5 million untested and undiagnosed adults, a portion of which are likely to be involved in some kind of court case.
Well,
And
just
because of
because
their
of
behavior, they're more likely than not to be misunderstood and taken advantage of by the you know, the opposing team.
It's just going to work against them.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that my book, and now I will say this, the readers of my book, and if you'll look at my Amazon and Goodreads ratings, I have over 1,000 ratings on both sites. Um,
Wow.
and the thing that touches me the most deeply is when someone who is very close to a neurodivergent child or sibling, and they tell me I knew from page one. But one woman also found hope in my book because she does not know, and of course, autism is a spectrum, and there's various abilities and uh, various levels. But she found a familiarity with Alvin by my description of him in my ignorance uh, perspective, but my description of his things he was doing at the time. She found hope for her son because she said, "Look, he was an admired TV repairman." And she found a lot of hope there, and hope that I didn't intend to write into the book, but she found it there. And that made me feel so good that the book affected somebody in that way.
Mm.
Even against all odds. And what was wonderful just was how the end of Alvin's life, how the community from the autism diagnosis, not only making him lighter in spirit, but it made the community start to turn their hearts toward him. And the book accelerated it. The book, Alvin was like one of the Beatles at these events. People would come up to him and they would want him to sign. Now, of course, Alvin was just busy signing his name and not interacting a lot because it was a lot of people. But I, on the other hand, it was a classic replaying out of our relationship in the past because I would get excited. Alvin, it's a juror from our case. And Alvin would look up and then he would go back to signing. And, Alvin, it's one of Virginia's cousins who's here to get you to sign a book. And he would
Oh,
look
wow.
up, look at her, and go back to signing. And then after the signings, he would say, "Hey, I enjoyed seeing that juror." Well, of course, he didn't express it at the time, but he really enjoyed signing books. So, Alvin was, I made sure that I knew he was 82 years old. So there was some limitations there. But Alvin gave me his own uh, limitations. He said, "I will not go anywhere in a propeller airplane, and I will not ride a motorcycle to these book events." And so and he also gave me 100-mile radius, and I stuck to that. And I miss him terribly as a friend, and just knowing that he could have continued to receive the love and affection that he had not felt his entire adult life. Um, I got some clues about Alvin's childhood as I was trying this case from his fourth grade teacher. She told me, well, he cried every day of fourth grade. And this was an autistic child that had not been diagnosed, who was being bullied, who did not like the changes that fourth grade were brought with it, changes in his friendships, changes in um, and I'm really glad a lot of that did not get in because Alvin would brag about some of his reactions to bullies. And one guy that stole his cap got whacked with a broom on his head, and another guy that did something, he stuck a pin in his arm so deep, the doctor had to remove it. Well, I get a call from an old man from Knoxville, Tennessee named Tadpole Byers. And I knew the minute when my secretary said, "There's a Tadpole Byers on the phone for you." The old man had read the book and he wanted to tell me about the time Alvin stuck a pin in his arm so deep that the doctor had to pull it out. But he deserved it because he had done something to Alvin. And so, I realized that Alvin was telling me the truth. And oh Lord, when you got him talking about his military stories, they were not for the squeamish and not for general audiences. But he
I
served our
wonder if he was
country.
better equipped to handle well, not the craziness, the horror of war. I wonder, or if he was more affected by it than neurotypical. What do you think?
I think Alvin, as a child, he acted as a child. He responded as a child would. As an adult, Alvin obsessed over things like the van, over things like just this feeling that everybody was against him. He used to post these missives that he would type out on this very familiar old typewriter. I got so used to seeing its its own imperfections. But he would post these missives on the inside of the glass of the shuttered TV shop. And so I would find myself over the years going over there and looking to see if I was on the list now that I was a public official. And fortunately, and I even had to have a a meeting with Alvin as the state rep one time where I told him to please quit cashing the check of another disabled person and taking 15% uh, to just simply cash their check. I told that individual to go get a bank account and they would give him 100% of the check and quit taking it to Alvin Ridley for cashing. And I kind of felt the need to confront Alvin just to tell him, I don't cash this man's check anymore. And Alvin, I was just met with a blank stare that others in town put a lot more menacing uh, effect to that blank stare. I just thought, he's just mad. He's just an angry old man. Old then was probably in his early 50s. And so Alvin was a blessing to me. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do after a decade in politics. I had not tried a lot of cases. Alvin gave me a second act, and maybe with this book, even a third. Um, so I owe Alvin Ridley a great deal. And I just want to tell his story as far and wide as it can be told. He really enjoyed the telling of the story. And, with Alvin, the way Alvin talked, it was all of his stories were about him outsmarting this person or that person. The most delighted he would be when he would talk about that time he outsmarted this person or that person. And I think he perceived the trial as the time we outsmarted all those people. And so I enjoyed having those talks with him. On my, Let me just tell you that TikTok is no place for a 65-year-old man to be. But my publisher wanted me to have all these platforms. And because some of these stories are so incredible, I started, with Alvin's permission, hearing his side of it. And I have posted some of those stories on social media with other him telling other stories. He turns out to be a very sweet, kind man who grieves greatly when his friends passed away. And one example of how Alvin was at school is he would tell me about this sweetheart that he used to have. Well, he asked me about her one day, and as I did during our lunches over the years, I would usually find an obituary and I would give him the bad news that some friend had passed, or in this case, a sweetheart. Well, he didn't have any reaction, and then the next time I saw him, he was distraught. And he brought a yearbook with him, and this was the entire basis of them being sweethearts, is what she wrote to him in his yearbook. And I learned that she's a senior and he's a freshman. And she's writing to him about how, it was so fun when we were sweethearts. Well, she was just being effusive teenage girl, you know, uh, the euphemism of them being sweethearts, just being a kind thing to write for Alvin's book. I later learned from some of his other classmates that Alvin was very small when he was a freshman. And this woman was a very beautiful, like majorette, and she was just being sweet to him. But in Alvin's world, they were sweethearts. And he told me if he had had reliable transportation, she'd have probably married him. And I'm thinking, yes, and a driver's license. So, I just got to where these stories that I used to be so worried about when I'm trying to come up with a defense for this guy, I eased up and actually enjoyed hearing his stories and, heard the same ones for many, many years over and over again. But I always enjoyed them because there'd be some little tweak, some new aspect that I hadn't heard before. So what
I
I
love
learned, Kim, I learned a lot about autism, and now I feel better prepared, better equipped to deal with it if I'm helping a client with it. And now, of course, we have all learned so much more. And so we're all better equipped, but I'm still seeing the possibilities. We all know a judge that would be very angry if the defendant is not looking him in the eye as he's considering his case. And we all know judges and DAs that are going to misinterpret a literal answer to a question that was not asking for a literal answer. And all of those things can add up just like they did with Alvin and lead to a wrongful charge.
I there's a lot of Alvins out there that are going to have better judgment because of the increased awareness. And hopefully they're going to add autism and other types of neurodivergent labels on the list of things to test for when they want to evaluate you know, the
My
defendants, I suspect, is going to be those who need to be evaluated more than the plaintiffs.
my local psychologist is still actually doing the job for defendants in North Georgia, and he has told me that he now includes testing for autism. So even if it just helps locally, it's going to be a great help, I hope.
There
And
you
and
go.
and if the book gets spread out, I would ask your listeners to please first get the right book. Get the one with Alvin and Virginia on the cover. Uh, but secondly, talk about it, uh, tell about it, uh, encourage other families to read it because you are the advocates. You are the true advocates. And while I, was an advocate for a few years with Alvin and now with another client, you are advocates every day. And if I didn't expect this, I just wrote Alvin as he was because I remember the conversations because we had the same conversations all the time. The van, the business failing, all of those things. But I know now that there was something else to it. And it was on our inability to process Alvin. Autism may be an inability to process neurotypical conversation. Well, I think it goes both ways. I was having difficulty processing Alvin. And so I see it as an equal two-way street issue. And I think that's the attitude we all have to have. It's incumbent upon us to learn how to interpret people who may be processing things differently than we are.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you having me, and I and
Thank you
I
so
would
much for
love
sharing
to.
all those stories.
Oh, I would
This
love to
was
hear from everyone. I'm easy to find. There's not many McCracken Postons in the world. There
yeah,
actually were three. My father was the original, and I named my son that. He goes by Mac, and
man.
he's down at the University of Georgia. And but I hope anybody will reach out to me with your thoughts or how the book made you feel, or and please review. There's nothing more wonderful than a review of a book. And I've been blessed with over 1,000 ratings and several hundred reviews, and I would love to build on that and get this story out there, get this story in the right hands to spread the word.
Absolutely. Let's get the story out there. Thank you so much, McCracken.
Kim, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And our listeners have a blessed week.